something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. This episode features part 2 of a presentation based on my recent American Exception Substack article, James Angleton, Mossad, the Syndicate, and the CIA's Cuban Business. About a year ago, in a document, I discovered a missing page that the CIA tried to hide by deleting it in subsequent releases. The 86th page, page number 86, shows that CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton did not tell CIA director John McCone that he was using a Mossad officer as an operational agent for anti-Castro operations in Cuba in order to bypass the entire CIA. The outcome was that there was very little paper trail at the agency when it came to the details of Angleton's mobbed-up Cuban business, especially the assassination apparatus, which many, if not most, JFK assassination researchers believe was later directed at President Kennedy. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. I've made this series public because I think the material is very important. If you appreciate this kind of serious, deep political research and analysis, consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. We have over 200 episodes and counting. If you want to better understand things like the JFK assassination, as well as other aspects of the deep history of the U.S. empire, American Exception is the place to go, especially if you want something more substantive and scholarly than internet conspiracism or whatever. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Subscribe if you can, and either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to the American Exception channel. We left off last time with the question, which is a subheading in the essay that I wrote: who killed JFK and what was Zionism's role? And I want to start this off by summarizing what I've been arguing or the conclusions that we can make, and maybe I'll state it even more plainly than I do in the article. I believe we can now say that President Kennedy was killed. The operation that killed him involved elements of the Central Intelligence Agency and elements of the National Crime Syndicate and elements of Mossad. This seems to be a clear inference based on the use of an Israeli agent to handle the assassination apparatus that was down in Cuba, which people have long believed was redirected at President Kennedy, and which was shrouded in secrecy and characterized by a lack of real official documentation or records that would explain key aspects of it. And investigations into this had the investigators themselves acknowledging that the people running these assassination programs were going to great lengths to avoid any paper trail or to put into writing real explicit discussion of assassination itself and who the targets were and who specifically all these people would be. Some of these assets, like the QJ Win cryptonym, we still don't know who they were today. They've decided not, or they've chosen, or they've been able not to tell us this. So the role of the Israeli intelligence service here is a key operational one, I believe, and I'll try to elaborate a little bit more on that in this episode. Additionally, I think the other major partner in this must have been the military brass, and especially their control of emergency doomsday network, continuity of government procedures and networks that can be used for communications and planning and so on. I believe that these were operative on the day that Kennedy was assassinated, and they were later operative on 9/11. They are a key part of the history that's still obscured there. So I believe that really what we're talking about within this regime is a neoconservative or a early neoconservative before neoconservatism, group of militarists and ultra-Zionists as well, and the people that were connected to organized crime, which was huge in the U.S. and very much intertwined with the capitalist oligarchy as well. It was really part and parcel of the oligarchy of private wealth in the United States, and it was a sort of indispensable part of the political economy of the U.S. because the more that I think about this and the development, economic development, political development, the political trajectory of the United States, the central conflict is how do you have a so-called democracy where a small minority is so rich and so powerful and has so much power over other people's lives and what they spend their lives doing and the kind of education they receive, the kind of news media they hear, everything is dominated by these giant concentrations of corporate wealth. And how do you keep people from voting that away? Well, the gangster element is there. So before there was a FBI and the CIA, it functioned in a similar way to act as this hidden hand of oligarchy. And so this is a part of it. And I think it's a big part of understanding the issue of Zionism in U.S. history and in the history of U.S. foreign policy as well. And they have a role here. But let me read what I wrote about this. All of this is not to argue that Israel killed JFK. I surmise that it was obviously the U.S. regime that killed JFK. This is the same regime that called for a global U.S. empire, an American century, as Henry Luce called it, during World War II. It allied with Lansky and Luciano during the war, removed Henry Wallace from the Democratic ticket in 1944, created the CIA in 1947, protected the international drug traffic after the war, recognized Israel in 1948, illegally overthrew or subverted democratic and or nationalistic governments all through the 50s, and then assassinated Patrice Lumumba and Dag Hammarskjöld too. I mean, all of these things happened leading up to the assassination of JFK. And this is in, a kind of a short amount of time when you stop and think about it. The end of the war, 1945, in 1963, it was only 18 years, right? So there's more distance between now and 9/11 than there was between JFK's presidency and the end of World War II. So so much was still up in the air in terms of how the U.S. empire was going to develop. President Kennedy's call for peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, his support for third world nationalism, his policy of withdrawal from Vietnam, and his opposition to the National Crime Syndicate were more than sufficient to compel the U.S. deep state to act. Kennedy's determination to prevent Israel from acquiring the bomb and his desire to solve the Palestinian refugee crisis were viewed as existential threats to Zionism by its apex. Even with that in mind, if we set aside JFK's Israel-Palestine policy entirely, his assassination was still overdetermined. So the major revision that I do think is warranted now is to those traditional and mostly well done understandings or theories about the assassination and who was behind it. A mystery now as to how Angleton and Helms and Dulles, this sort of group within the CIA, even though Dulles was out of it, how this network was able to create a CIA within the CIA that included assassination and partnerships, institutionalized partnerships with the mob. And Angleton really was the person who handled both of it. But, how exactly was he able to bureaucratically pull this off, given that the Central Intelligence Agency answers to the president, and he gets to appoint his director, and the director could even potentially go after the rest of the CIA for the president on behalf of the president. That's what Nixon attempted, and Watergate, is a part of that story. So now we can say that there is another actor here, there's anti-Castro Cubans as well. They were a part of this, and they were connected to the mob, connected to the CIA as well. So it's hard to know exactly how much independent agency to give them. I don't see them as being a powerful constituency in and of themselves. I see them in and of themselves. I see them as being useful, hatchet men and drug runners and so on, and other, doing other jobs for the mob. That's why after the Bay of Pigs invasion, a lot of those guys end up trafficking, in drugs, a lot of them, because this was the position that they occupied in this sort of disguised fascist regime. And then this CIA within the CIA and its partnership with organized crime is like the deepest part of this deep state, we could say. And the surprise is that it links to Mossad, which is even more unhinged and untethered to any kind of, legal or moral restrictions than the CIA is. They don't have a constitution in Israel, and Mossad answers to the prime minister and basically him alone, as I understand it. And they are a more explicitly exceptionist entity than what the U.S. has. So it's there's a logic to having Israel, Zionism, Zionists handle the darkest parts of the aggressive U.S. imperialism, because they're totally committed to a unipolar dominant U.S. that destroys everybody, like Paul Wolfowitz wanted, the Wolfowitz doctrine, just defeat any country that could potentially pose a threat to the U.S. Dominance, plan for global dominance. But with Kennedy in the White House as the president, this presented a problem for the deep state. And here I'm talking about two deep states, really. As I've tried to explain in my I explained it in the book, in my dissertation. I've tried to clarify it ever since, and I think about it a lot. And, there's a kind of duality. I know there's a dual state, and there's a public state and a deep state. Well, there's also a duality to the idea of the deep state that I've tried to put forward here. On the one side, there is this, like, what we could call the deep state, which is, in this case, Angleton's CIA within the CIA in the form that it took at that time, where it's a clandestine network that is organized in some discernible way to someone, even if we're not privy to the way that it is organized and networked in the end. Okay, that's the hidden hand, in a sense. There's that idea of that can intervene and veto politics. That's one sort of clandestine organizational way of understanding the deep state. But perhaps a deeper meaning of the deep state really corresponds to the political science concept of the regime. So if the state is that organization which has a monopoly on violence in a given territory, right? If that's what the state is, well, the regime, by political science reckoning, is all of those institutions which collectively determine who controls the state. So in America, we believe we have a democratic regime, but my argument is that we really don't. We have a tripartite state, and there is a democratic aspect to this and to the regime in terms of there are elections, and they have people vote, and they determine who is going to be, the president, congressman, etc. But there's this deeper anti-democratic force that intervenes, and it can even intervene, and we can call this the deep state. It's really oligarchy. We could say it's capitalism in the most generic sense, because it always produces top-down rule by an oligarchy of wealth. But it's this bigger, you can call it the establishment. Okay. And in the case of Kennedy, the regime had a problem because it's a fiction that the regime is democratic, but in reality, these guys, this oligarchy, had to deal with Kennedy, and he was in charge of the state, but he was acting against the regime. He was really trying to change the regime from a one bent on imperialism and global dominance to one that was moving more towards a peaceful and lawful international cooperation. And if he was really successful in ending the Cold War, that would have eliminated the basis, the foundation for all of the covert operations and different exploitative arrangements, neo-colonial arrangements and pursuits that the U.S. was and U.S. oligarchs were looking for all around the world. So this was a problem. All right. So having said all that, we'll get back to the article, which does say all these things and, maybe in passing, but I hope that that's useful context for people. The problem for the deep state, both in the clandestine and establishment regime senses of the term, was that John F. Kennedy was the president. As the head of the state, JFK had considerable control over the government. Okay, JFK is the head of state. So if you say the state killed the head of state, then this is problematic, right? This is why it's a difficult, thorny issue to unpack. Okay, to assassinate JFK, the regime needed to rely on those regime elements which were the most secretive and least accountable. Angleton's CIA within the CIA was crucial. Lansky's National Crime Syndicate was a major component of this clandestine U.S. deep state. Mossad also played an indispensable role in this network. As stated at the outset, Angleton was not merely the CIA's chief of counterintelligence, he also handled the Israeli account. Unofficially, he handled what we could call the CIA's syndicate account. Recall the words of J.C. King, the CIA's Western Hemisphere chief, from the beginning of this essay. Angleton has these ties to the mafia, and he's not going to do anything to jeopardize them. Given Meyer Lansky's status as an Israeli agent, we could say that the syndicate account was ultimately a subsidiary of the Israeli account. And that, I suppose, is the most explosive claim that I'm making here, and I don't think I'm the first person to hypothesize this, but I'm hoping to make it in a solid and scholarly way that is empirically substantiated by the arguments and empirical evidence that I would come up with. So you can decide if that's true or not. Now, besides the key Mossad role in facilitating the CIA's murderous Cuban business while keeping the dirty details away from the rest of the CIA, including its director, there are other Israeli angles to the assassination. Counterintelligence staffer that James Angleton apparently assigned to read Lee Harvey Oswald's mail for 20 months prior to the JFK assassination was Reuben Ephron. As Jefferson Morley notes, Warren Commission records list Ephron as being present in the room when they interviewed Marina Oswald. Ephron was the only attendee whose role and job title were not listed. Morley believes that he was there so he could report everything back to Angleton. While Ephron cannot be linked directly to Mossad, his commitment to Zionism and belief in spycraft are apparent. As the Times of Israel reported, a deep dive into Ephron's Jewish identity reveals that Ephron not only worked as a spy, but had a deep knowledge of the spies in the Jewish tradition. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency has confirmed that Ephron spent time living in Israel before dying on November 22nd, 1993, 30 years to the day after Kennedy's assassination. While there, he contributed 5 articles in the 1970s to the Jewish Bible Quarterly, a world Zionist organization affiliated publication based in Jerusalem that channeled his expertise in espionage. So this is a person, and by the way, since I wrote this article, Jeff Morley, who I will be interviewing soon, and we'll be talking about these things, he wrote in an article about Ephron that Ephron was recruited not through normal. He worked for Angleton in counterintelligence, but he wasn't recruited by the normal CIA hiring processes. He was someone that Angleton just found, and it's not really explained. But given Angleton's explanation of his relationship to Israel and how they were so useful in terms of getting people out of the Eastern Bloc, the people who had useful information, who had left the Eastern Bloc, left the Soviet Union or other communist countries, other communist Soviet socialist republics, or countries in Eastern Europe. This fits with that perfectly. And then he later wrote, these articles for the World Zionist Organization. This, to me, it's not a stretch or paranoid to say that this guy, knowing Angleton, was directed to him by Mossad and would have been, somebody who was loyal to Mossad, if not already a Mossad agent by the time by the time he came to Angleton. I think that this is a case where it's not irresponsible to postulate that this person is an agent of Israel, and that's precisely why he was there. Now, this is very interesting because it means that Angleton and Israel are involved in 2 aspects of the plot, which we have believed that rogue, quote unquote rogue, elements of the CIA, including Angleton, were involved with. The assassination apparatus itself, which seems to be linked to the ZR rifle program and figures like William Harvey and David Morales and such, and then mafia figures as well. but also in the running of Oswald and in the monitoring of Oswald after the assassination. So you have a Mossad person in charge of monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald's mail before the assassination, which was supposedly to see if Oswald was fit for being a contact agent or some kind of source of information or asset for the CIA, because he'd been behind the Iron Curtain, right? That's the ostensible reason for these mail monitoring programs. But it's pretty obvious that they would have a utility for assessing whether Oswald was a valuable or viable patsy for this kind of an operation. Is he still playing the part of a communist? Is he writing anything that's going to give away, to what he is saying to people? And if so, you could intercept any letter like that. You have him surveilled, and you have him surveilled by someone who is loyal not to the CIA so much as an institution, but to Angleton and, in all likelihood, to Mossad. Well, let's say, I don't know how to handicap the odds of it, but I would just say it seems quite likely the guy was connected to Mossad, and that this is who Angleton was using. And then he's there monitoring Marina Oswald while she's testifying after the assassination. Okay, so now we see another connection here. Whatever one makes of Efron, perhaps the most obvious Israeli link to the JFK assassination is in the personage of Jack Ruby. This is not a function of Ruby being Jewish. Rather, it's a function of Ruby's status as the syndicate man in Dallas, essentially a lieutenant of sorts. His connection to the Lansky Teamster syndicate milieu in Dallas, Chicago, Las Vegas, and the West Coast are detailed in the larger article from which this piece has been excerpted and adapted. Much more is written about this in Peter Dale Scott's masterpiece, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. I conclude that Ruby was selected for his role in the assassination precisely because he was tied to so many deep political arrangements, especially the national security state's partnership with the syndicate, that his presence guaranteed a cover-up. If nothing else, any investigation would have discredited the U.S. as being far too mobbed up to be any sort of legitimate leader of the free world, quote unquote. Angleton's network not only placed a literal nuclear bomb threat in the personage of Oswald via manipulated intelligence from Mexico City, the use of Ruby placed a political bomb threat into the plot by using Ruby to murder the designated culprit, Lee Oswald. And as I was saying this, and I've said in the past, by using Ruby in this way and his connections to very sensitive mob syndicate historical events, like the connection of the Teamster pension funds to the syndicate through the personage of Paul Dorfman, who became Harvey's big confidant. And when the murder happened, which allowed Dorfman to take over this local union, Jack Ruby was in the room and was arrested, I believe, and then likely became an informant then. And also, the person that he was close to with this Dallas syndicate connection, when he went into Dallas to be the syndicate's man there, was Paul Roland Jones, whose guys, Dave and Sam Yaris, were, as I understand it, blamed, eventually given credit or responsibility or blame for the murder of James Reagan, which was a part of the takeover of the National Wire Service, which consolidated gambling, racketeering, and so on, and basically corruption into a nationwide network. This was a huge pillar of the national crime syndicate. And Ruby was right there. And this was something that corrupted so many officials and policemen and congressmen and business people. Once the Teamsters and the mob were in a city, as they said explicitly they planned to do with Dallas, it's like a political attack on the institutions of these cities. They take over. Once they get cops, as Peter Dale Scott explains, and he's quoted other people about this, and he has more knowledge into this area than I do. But once you had officials taking bribes for a little bit of gambling here and there, then you've basically got them for whatever else, because they're already corrupt and they're already making money from it. They're already profiting from it. And then you can't expose that operation. And then the operation only gets bigger and brings in more patrons and makes more people richer. And so then it becomes even more difficult to go after. And that's why they never really do. They never succeed in going after organized crime, because it's a part of our system. The last person to really talk about it in this way and seriously go after it was Robert Kennedy. And he never met with his organized crime unit after his brother's assassination. It was like the syndicate won, the deep state won. So the significance of the Zionist role in the JFK assassination, it involves a difficult question of how to think of some of these figures from the deep state milieu, the syndicate CIA milieu that surrounds the Kennedy assassination. So you look at these figures like Rosselli, okay, if that's Johnny Rosselli there on the left, and he is not considered an ideological Zionist or a person who first and foremost was interested in the state of Israel. But if the structure of the syndicate was, as Peter and others have argued or suggested, if it really was dominated at the top by Lansky as the mob's accountant, as the guy who owns, a bigger chunk of Las Vegas than anyone else, then you have to think that they're functionally under the control of Lansky, who is connected to Mossad, and it seems to be in later years, after World War II, trying to discern Lansky's motives and objectives. It's easier to argue, I believe, that more so than a mobster who was interested in just building this great criminal empire, that he was an agent of Israel, and that he worked to insinuate people very loyal to Israel into the oligarchy of the United States, and to vast fortunes were made with the profits in all sorts of industries, with the profits from the drug trade, and the National Crime Syndicate managed all of these. And the key that Lansky found when he was setting up any of his enterprises is not so much to be the, you don't want to be the gambler in these card games. You want to be the person that owns the card games. That's the person who wins. The person who owns the casino. The house always wins. That's the rule of gambling. And if you're smart, you figure that out. But that general dynamic, when you take it and you upscale it to, bigger political, deep political arrangements, means that the key is to be able to bribe the officials, to have the corrupt officials, to have the connection that your criminal network, your lucrative racket is protected, and that the cops don't go after you. And once you do that, then the cops almost become the defenders of the racket, because they still need to arrest people. And so the best way to do that is to arrest the competitors of any, unit. And this sort of dynamic plays out, and you end up with a very consolidated kind of national crime syndicate. And Lansky, as the accountant of it all, and the person who created Vegas and ran it as the sort of money laundering headquarters of the deep political economy of the U.S., he would have had intimate knowledge of all of the corrupt localities, states, cities. I mean, this is an enormous and useful, you call it a data set, or it's hard to even wrap one's mind around this. The consolidation of crime and corruption in the U.S., and then you look at Lansky's connections and ties, loyalty to Zionism, and then you understand that this likely meant that the Mossad would have had a deep understanding of the fine details of American political corruption. And as a capitalist, advanced, rich capitalist society, there was the corruption and the pursuit of money and profit over everything else. These are so endemic to American society. They've come to define American society, unfortunately, which is why we're a sick society. But this national crime syndicate is not just a bunch of Italians sitting around. I think that the guy, and it's not like the Simpsons are the Simpsons, the Sopranos. I don't think that is that's the model. I think that that's like a cover story, basically. And the truth is, the mob is way bigger, and it's supranational. It's a major part of Western imperialism, Western capitalism, U.S. capitalism. And the problem really is the system of imperial capitalism. It turned out that the Zionists ended up occupying a particular role in this. So if we look through these different people, I already mentioned Rosselli, who ran the wire service out in LA. and he has connections to Ruby. I mean, so Ruby worked at the Santa Anita racetrack. So did Sirhan later. And it was reported by a journalist that Rosselli met in Florida with Ruby in the months before leading up to the Kennedy assassination. So that's never been proven, but it's, a possibility. There's some reports that happened. The guy to his right at the top is Dorfman, Paul Dorfman, the person who took over local junk handlers union. And that takeover was cited by no less than Robert F. Kennedy in his book, The Enemy Within, as a pivotal moment in which the syndicate and the Teamsters became, they achieved the symbiosis and alliance that they would later on, centered around the use of the Teamster pension funds. The guy below him is Louis McWillie, who's a close friend of or associate of Jack Ruby, and then the symbols about his relationship to Ruby later. He admitted at one point, as I recall from Peter Dell Scott's book, Deep Politics, I believe that's where this account is, that Ruby had that he had been to Cuba to visit Trafficante when Trafficante was in jail, and that one of the people who may have accompanied him was Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby might have been there. And this was reported by another British journalist as well, that Jack Ruby had been a part of discussions about how to potentially spring Trafficante from jail. Trafficante is the guy who goes on to succeed Meyer Lansky after Lansky apparently steps down in 1970. And for whatever reason, there's this power struggle over the structure of the syndicate. And I believe Watergate is related to that struggle. But Louis McWillie, again, not somebody who I know as being a devoted Zionist or somebody who would have cared about Zionists one way or the other, but as a syndicate person and a connection to Ruby, he's a clear connection to Ruby being tied to organized crime. And the fact that this wasn't discussed is a key to understanding the Kennedy assassination. And again, as I say, even the use of Ruby itself is like so provocative. Wasn't there, it seems to be not just a move of desperation, like how can we possibly kill this guy? It seemed to be a sort of master stroke to use this person, if my analysis is correct. To the right of Dorfman is Jimmy Hoffa, of course. And if you read the book by Sally Denton and Roger Morris about Las Vegas, which I think is The Money and the Power, they talk about him visiting Israel, starting in the 1940s. As I recall, and that he was even there working with Lansky to help to make sure that the weapons shipments got to the Zionists and so on. So it seems like from the beginning, if Hoffa was a Zionist even before the State of Israel, and he was instrumental to facilitating those arms shipments, and he visits there later, and he makes all these loans to figures in Vegas, many of whom we are connected in that Lansky milieu of Zionist, wise guys. Then, Hoffa seems to be not the kingpin of the American underworld, but somebody subordinate to Lansky, essentially. Which I think explains what happens to him. Below him is first Reuben Ephron, the guy working for Angleton that I told you that I mentioned earlier. He's a Lithuanian-born Jewish fellow who later went to Israel and wrote for World Zionist Organization publications about spies in Jewish history. And he came to Angleton through unusual networks or channels. Quite likely Mossad. To the right of him is Mickey Cohen, who also was a part of the milieu around Ruby, and he was a LA mobster and a huge committed Zionist. To the right of him is William Harvey, and he's a Indiana-born ex-FBI hard-drinking person. His own colleague at the CIA, John Whitten, more or less said he suspected him of involvement in the Kennedy assassination. And again, he's another person who wouldn't say first and foremost you would characterize him as a committed Zionist, but he was the person who, worked with Rosselli and to organize some of these Castro assassination plots. And so, functionally, if he's working for Angleton and he is working with Rosselli, who is a subordinate of in the National Crime Syndicate, ultimately run by Lansky, then he's brought into this network, which is not necessarily or even majority about Zionism. It's most of the web of people that and oligarchs who would have been against Kennedy. I don't believe that Zionist Jews were the majority there. But the structure of the underworld does seem to have a Zionist bent, and when you think about this issue of, okay, wait, is the syndicate really essentially at this time in Lansky, is it a Mossad operation of sorts, like the biggest intelligence operation, maybe and most impactful perhaps in human history? It's hard to say. But when you do look at that, it actually makes a lot of events make sense that don't make sense otherwise. And I hope to be able to elaborate more on that. So, because hovering over all this, presiding over all this, is looming in the background is Lansky himself. And as I've said earlier, I've tried to suggest that Lansky and the effort to sort of transform or unravel or restructure the National Crime Syndicate in 1970 led to Watergate. Well, there's another letter. This is a letter from 1980 that I'm going to talk about here. But there's another letter I found from 1975 where Lansky is saying something that corroborates more or less my working theory here. When he says, yeah, Nixon, it's just like I told you, Nixon thought he could take over. What a disaster. This is in 1975, meaning like I take this to mean he saw Watergate and Nixon's downfall as Nixon trying to take over the deep state, the clandestine deep state, the mob intelligence network, and to bend it into something that was more at the control of the president, and which would have been more nationalistic. And, he failed. So Lansky seems to be, Lansky saying that Nixon wasn't like corrupt, that he was trying to take over. It begs the question of like, what was he trying to take over? And Lansky seems to play a big part here. He flees to Israel because they indict him in 1970, and then he flees to Israel, I think in 71, and he stays there until 73. And Nixon is obviously still in power. So if he's really on the run from Nixon, then why would he come back in 73? But I believe by 73, that's when all this Watergate material comes out. This sort of time bomb gets planted in the Nixon administration in the summer of 1972. And then when he wins in 73, I think, but he wins in 72, but he fires Helms. And James McCord is in jail, who is Angleton's subordinate, essentially. And he's there as one of the plumbers. And he is so fixated on the idea that the CIA should not be blamed for Watergate. And he says that if Helms gets fired, every tree in the forest will fall. It'll be a scorched desert. And I think that's because it was, as I've argued here in this, it was Helms who was protecting this whole clandestine deep state, this CIA within a CIA, and its relationship with some sort of overriding regime entity that killed Kennedy. And it involves the syndicate, it involves the CIA within the CIA, and it includes assassinations, and it has control of the global drug traffic, and it has enough money and power to be this sort of dark force in U.S. politics. So anyway, Lansky is able to return to the U.S. in 1973, but he doesn't end up in jail, and he ends up going to he lives his golden years in a nursing home in Florida where he had set up his own criminal empire. But here he is writing in 1980, and this is from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and the headline is, of course, Meyer Lansky can return to Israel for high holidays. But he writes this letter, and this is from the web page. It's the Farkash Gallery, which sells like Zionist art and very pro-Israel, material there. And this was a letter that I believe they auctioned off, but maybe it was part of an exhibit at one point when they wrote about this letter. But the letter is not the article. The article is just talking about his trip being okayed in 1980. But then around this same time, this letter, July 6, 1980, Meyer Lansky to Joseph Scheiner, who is described as a respected figure in the Israeli Mossad and Lansky's close friend. In the 1960s, this guy that Lansky was writing to was Ben-Gurion's security director. And this is from the Farkesh Gallery. After Prohibition ended in 1933, Lansky successfully parlayed his fortune into gambling interests around the United States and ultimately internationally. In the 1940s, Lansky began investing in Las Vegas casinos and assigned his friend Siegel, Bugsy Siegel, to oversee the construction of the Flamingo Hotel. Some believed that Siegel, who also tightly controlled income from the telephone race wire, providing sports results to the bookie parlors and casinos, was stealing a portion of their investment. Well, okay, this is the kind of counterfeit history or limited hangout history here, because if you read Alfred McCoy's Politics of Heroin, which I think of as the most sober and kind of unimpeachable, cautious investigation of the CIA and U.S. national security state collaboration with drug traffickers. He talks about Lansky and Luciano setting up enormous drug trafficking operations. And the Las Vegas, as Peter has detailed and other people have written about, this Las Vegas was established to be a sort of money laundering hub for Mexican heroin that they had set up. That Lansky had a heroin connection in Mexico. And this was the reason that Vegas is established, is to launder the money from this. And Bugsy Siegel, who ran that Flamingo Hotel, I believe, and Peter Dale Scott writes in almost in passing in Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, that the story of him being killed merely for cost overruns and taking too much money at the Flamingo, this is likely not really the case. He was likely killed because of the racing wire and the fact that he wanted to control it when it needed to be monopolized in a different way and overseen by other figures, not somebody as disreputable as Siegel. And I believe it gets run by the Annenberg family, which is somehow more respectable. Like, they go on to own TV Guide, which was the biggest circulating magazine, in the decades after World War II. They owned the Philadelphia Inquirer, but the older Annenberg had gone to jail and was a known Lansky associate. So, the history of this is covered up, and part of the problem is that, as the French Balzac said, behind every great fortune is a not forgotten crime. Many of the big families, rich families, oligarch families in the U.S. are tied to kind of illicit activity and gangster activity. I mean, pretty much any time to make a huge fortune, you've got to be a monopolist or another in one way or another, find a way to manipulate the political economy such that you can make a ton of money yourself personally. And that's like the American dream in terms of business. And that's how great family fortunes are made. I mean, capitalism, it's not that much of an exaggeration to say capitalism is organized crime, in my estimation. So here's more on Ruby as a person in this sort of Lansky milieu. By the way, I want to say something else about this here, these figures. And if you want to think about who really had the power here among these figures, and I don't know the details of everybody here, but there are those who would want to say it's the Italian mafia or it's Hoffa or something like that, or it was just these people in the CIA. A lot of these people die at very inopportune times. Johnny Rosselli when the House, if it's really this Italian mafia thing and they have the power to just veto U.S. policy and execute the president and get away with it. Well, who in the mafia? Because Rosselli at this time ends up, after he testifies to the church committee, he's called back to testify again, as I recall, and he disappears, and he later is found in a barrel in Key Biscayne in Florida, chopped up into pieces. So Rosselli is apparently not the person at the top of this. That's pretty obvious. If people would want to, and even RFK in sort of his cosmology while he was in the White House as the Attorney General, posits Hoffa as kind of the head of the National Crime Syndicate, but he also went after the Las Vegas casino skim and so on, right? So he had a sense of really what was really at stake here with the syndicate, and it's telling that nobody else goes back to resume this struggle. And Hoffa is incarcerated, but then after JFK dies, he is, because they've been pursuing this case against him for a long time. And there wasn't any way to stop that. But there's all these efforts by people like, Rosselli, and they use these Jack Anderson articles in 1967 to perhaps suggest that, that the CIA was involved in the Kennedy assassination. And some people have suggested that different, things like the Garrison investigation were about just Jimmy Hoffa, right? But Hoffa, if Hoffa is really this supremely important figure, why does he also end up dead in 1975 when they're reinvestigating the Kennedy assassination? He would have been a key guy to explain the structure of the National Crime Syndicate, which is who they ultimately try to blame it on in a oblique way. The House Select Committee, when they reinvestigate the assassination in the late 70s, they say that JFK was killed by a probable conspiracy and it likely involved members of organized crime. Well, okay, but what about for one thing, they eliminate Hoffa from this equation. So Blakey actually goes back and has a pre-Robert Kennedy version, more of the J. Edgar Hoover version of the mafia, where the Teamsters aren't really a part of it. That's systematically taken out. Why is it taken out? Is it taken out in this new limited hangout cover story of the Kennedy assassination, which says, yeah, maybe organized crime did it. But then how do you eliminate Hoffa from that equation? And why? If it's because Hoffa is really so powerful and untouchable, well, then why does Hoffa end up dead in 1975? I think that this is, if you stop and think about it, more circumstantial evidence for the thesis that the National Crime Syndicate was a multi-ethnic confederation, and that Lansky seems to have been the pinnacle of it. And that has many explosive implications. Likewise, Bill Harvey dies in the 70s. When they could have, I believe, during the time of the House Select Committee. I think he survives somehow, maybe the Church Committee, and then he might die in 76, but somebody could go back and check the dates. But he dies in that same time period. So does David Morales. Of course, Jack Ruby is incarcerated in prison. And as we've discussed elsewhere on the podcast, if you subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon, we have a long series with Max Arvo, where we discuss how Jack Ruby was essentially turned over to his lawyers were like CIA, MK Ultra, or Syndicate connected, but especially CIA, MK Ultra as things go on. And he probably got dosed with acid by Jolly and West before he was able to speak to Earl Warren was interviewed, which could be a part of why he sounds a little nuts in that interview. But he's also making statements that clearly point to a conspiracy, and he has a new trial coming up, and then he just gets this insanely fast-acting cancer that kills him. So, go figure. All right. Now, this gets into Ruby more. This is from Michael Kurtz, and he wrote this book, Crime of the Century. He's a history professor, I believe, at a Louisiana university. He wrote, in the month prior to the assassination, Ruby telephoned Irwin Weiner, a front man for organized crime, Robert Barney Baker, an associate of Jimmy Hoffa's, Nofio J. Pecora, a lieutenant of the reputed Louisiana mafia boss Carlos Marcello, Louis McWillie, who had ties with organized crime figures Santos Trafficante and Meyer Lansky, and Murray Dusty Miller, another individual closely allied with Hoffa and the mafia. So there are enormous connections to Ruby to mob figures. He was clearly a syndicate figure, and we, as a matter of historical record, we do not really have a clear and decisive, definitive account of what the structure of the syndicate during this period really was. It was massive. Robert Kennedy, the one presidential administration that went after it, the Kennedys, both of those brothers ended up dead, shot in the head, and this should be instructive. Likewise, just to add to this, LBJ was the most mob-friendly president ever. He basically told them they had to stop wiretapping people. They let them make these civil liberties complaints, and it somehow turned into this crusade, the outcome of which was to save they were making statements to the effect of like the FBI was like the Gestapo for going after the way they're treating these mobsters. But this is absurd when you know how mobbed up LBJ was. So these were clearly covered up, the organized crime connections of Ruby. And when they finally do address them in the late 70s, they come up with this sort of Cosa Nostra thing. And they make all these, there's all these mob movies that are considered classics back then. Now, you have to think of it as this like a kind of cultural cover story for us to like make us stupid as to understanding the real nature of organized crime in the United States. It's just a sort of cartoon of the Godfather cartoon or something. Just a bunch of, random Italians. This is from Peter's book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. FBI documents released in 1979 show other instances in which key information was either altered before it reached the Warren Commission or else withheld altogether. For example, judging from Warren Commission records, the FBI covered up Jack Ruby's connections to organized crime. The commission did not receive an important interview with Louis Kuttner, a Chicago lawyer who had just told the press correctly about Ruby's connections to Chicago mobsters Lenny Patrick and Dave Yaris. All the FBI transmitted was a meaningless follow-up interview in which Kuttner merely said he had no additional information. Kuttner more explicitly, as I recall, said Jack Ruby was a syndicate lieutenant. And I think that may be a better explanation even than Peter's kind of complicated and cautious attempts at characterizing what precisely we could say Ruby was. He saw him as a figure in the gray alliance between organized crime and law enforcement, etc. And so, but I think that lieutenant of the syndicate would be good. If the syndicate is this Lansky entity, and we know that Ruby's job was partly to be a fixer, to be the person who managed the fix with the local authorities, that's really the way the syndicate operates. So he as a syndicate lieutenant seems totally logical, and I don't know why that's not the more well understood or the consensus view, really. I think that part of the issue of dealing with Ruby that's hard for JFK researchers is that there's a whole group of people who traditionally have wanted to blame the mob for the assassination of JFK. And I think that there's a kind of ideological reason for wanting to do this. You don't want to acknowledge that the regime itself is this sinister. So if you can look at the mob almost like in a way, the way that Nazis would want to use, Jews back in the day, you can say it's not this systemic issue, this institutional and systemic issue of like the political economy of capitalism and how it is, it has a symbiosis, if not, overlap with crime, what we would think of as crime. This is, then you can blame it on something else. You can blame it on these other actors. It could be like capitalism and democracy work, liberalism is good, but there's a dark side and the mob represents it and they're very sinister and they could even do some really bad things like kill the president. Okay, this is like the Germans in a sense were like, no, we can't have a socialist takeover. We got to defend the nation. The problem isn't these industrial cartels and oligarchs that led us into this disastrous, war, World War I. It's really the Jews. The Jews are the problem. Okay, it's the Jews, it's the mafia, it's the Russians. It's always got to be something to, blame for the top-down evil that unfolds historically. So I think that the people who understand that the U.S. elements of the U.S. state, U.S. regime killed JFK, don't necessarily want to look at the mob and the real structure of the mob. And so it's this controversial way of looking at it. And the camps, if you say the CIA did it, or if you say the national security state did it, or if you say the mob did it, but if you say the oligarchs did it, but if they're all kind of intertwined and they're all deeply networked and they're all basically part of a coalition that's there to make sure that like democracy doesn't prevail and that imperialism, global neo-colonialism are the order of the day, that's a more damning indictment. And I think it's closer to the truth. And I think if you understand that, then you have a better understanding of why everything in the U.S. is so corrupt and insane and immune to any change, because any change for the positive that would be for the good of people in democracy is considered a threat to these people. It's a threat to the gains they've made in the past, and it's a threat to their current status. Could be a threat of criminal prosecution if you had disclosure of these different crimes. So you can't get investigation of criminality, and you cannot get reform of criminogenic institutions and political arrangements and economic arrangements. It's really the heart of the West, of Western capitalism, is this gangster essence at the apex. So the capitalist oligarch has a mentality of like boundless greed that, in essence is no different from the mafioso. Apparently, the FBI also failed to transmit a teletype revealing that Yaris, a national hitman for the Chicago syndicate who had grown up with Ruby and who had been telephoned by one of Ruby's Teamster contacts on the eve of the assassination, was about to attend a hoodlum meeting of top East and West Coast syndicate representatives, including some of the family of former Havana crime lord Santos Traficante. And Traficante, by the way, not only does he take over the role of Lansky, presumably in 1970. And I believe that the Kruger has also written about this, the Danish, I think he's a Danish journalist, if I recall correctly. He's in the book, The Great Heroin Coup. Peter wrote the introduction for that. And Peter has written about Traficante's takeover of the Lansky role, I believe. So it's worth, and Traficante in Cuba and his father, Santos Traficante Jr., and then there's senior too, but he was connected to Lansky, and he was essentially Lansky's representative in Cuba, and that seems to be his role there at this time. And it's noteworthy, just to I don't want to get too deep into this, but consider the fact that when the U.S. indicts Lansky, shortly thereafter, you end up with Watergate, which is part of the political regime going after another part of it in different ways, right? And it plays out in the media through leaks and so on. And this is at the time that the control of the syndicate is in flux and is up for grabs. Well, also and I don't have a master theory on the dynamics of all this, but consider that in 1986, Santo Traficante is indicted. And he dies, I think, in 87. But very shortly or around the same time, you have the Iran-Contra scandal emerging, which also deals with drug trafficking, just like the Watergate burglars themselves were all implicated in, or many of them, the majority of them were implicated in the drug traffic and sort of syndicate, drug trafficking in one way or another. So, what do we make of that? Special thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and to Mock Orange and Michelle Boley for the music intro. And thank you for tuning in. Please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. We will be back shortly with the third and final part of this presentation. Part 3 will focus. We will be back shortly with the third and final part of this presentation. Part 3 will focus on the significance of the Zionist role in the JFK assassination. I believe, as I will argue, that the sinister influence of the Zionist constituency of the American oligarchy or deep state had a major impact on the way that history played out on the devil's chessboard that is US-led Western imperialism.